We'd like to welcome everybody to Thanksgiving at the Wishart. It's our tradition to do a little rehearsing of some of the heritage that we have in Thanksgiving, and just pause a little while to take time to be a little bit thankful, which certainly we have so much to be thankful for. When we think back to the history of Thanksgiving, it's one of my favorite holidays because it's a very American holiday, and as such, it's a patriotic thing, I guess. But we can go back to 1620, when in November, after being 3 months on the Mayflower, the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth. There were 102 individuals who spent most of that 3 months, almost that entire 3 months, between decks in the ship because it was stormy. It was past the normal time for people to be able to sail across the Atlantic, and the total space they had was about the size of a volleyball court. You think about a volleyball court and what it would be like to pack 102 people. Now we got 20 people or so on our patio, and it looks like it's pretty close quarters, but imagine being this close together for 3 months while we're enduring storms and not able to cook because they weren't able to have fires to cook in between decks, so they're eating cold food, and people are sick, and it was not a pleasant place to be. They arrived, and when they arrived, they made an amazing discovery, and that was they found land that had been cleared for farming, and there was no one there. No one owned it. It had a good harbor, good natural drainage, natural springs. It was an ideal place to settle. And they began building a palisade and a blockhouse, a place where they could defend themselves. They had heard that there were hostile Indians in the area that would be a threat to them, and so they began to build this blockhouse. The captain of the Mayflower, agreed to stay through the winter, because this is November when they arrived in New England. There was already snow. It snowed. It was cold. It froze. When they do their little sailing ventures out from the Mayflower that was anchored in the harbor, it was a pretty harsh environment, and the Mayflower provided shelter for them. They were able to stay in the Mayflower while they're working. The men stayed at their work and slept on the ground during that time. They did go through a very difficult winter, though. Beginning in December of 1620, those who had been through this ordeal of traveling from Europe to the New World were weakened. They started to get sick. Some of them started to die. And in fact, in February there were 17 deaths among the 102. In March there were 13 more. By spring, 47 of the original 102 of the Pilgrims had died. They buried them in a common grave. They didn't mark them with headstones. They didn't want the Indians to realize how many of their number had dwindled. But they had gone through a very, very difficult time. They were motivated to come and endure this in search of the religious freedom, being able to worship God according to their understanding of the Scriptures. It was in March of that spring, in 1621, that they met an Indian named Samoset, who introduced them to Squanto, and Squanto was the one who became their salvation in this wilderness. Really, allowed them to survive. They didn't know how to live in this wilderness. They didn't know how to be able to survive. But the story of Squanto is a story that I'd like to take a little time to talk about today because he had an amazing story. God had providentially prepared him to be able to be there to care for the pilgrims when they arrived in the New World. And so back up 15 years, 1605, Captain George Weymouth, who'd been exploring the New England coast, kidnapped 5 Poxtet Indians, including Tisquantum, or Squanto, as he came to be known. Took them to England with the idea of teaching them English and learning from them about this land and where would be a good place to settle, where would be good places to trade, and just to be able to learn from them. But he was taken forcibly against his will to England. In 1614, Squanto found another captain. This was Captain John Smith, who was sailing back to New England, and so he made his journey, came back to New England, back to his homeland. But unfortunately, or as part of God's plan perhaps, in that same year he was lured on board by Captain Thomas Hunt, who had been traveling with John Smith and was instructed to stay and dry beaver pelts and do some more trading. He had something else in mind. He got some unsuspecting Poxtets on board his ship, supposedly to trade with them, clamped them in irons, and he had in mind the slave trade, which was far more profitable than beaver skins, and took them to Spain, where he was where they were sold into slavery. Squanto was rescued by some friars, Franciscan friars, who bought him as a slave for the purpose of introducing him to Christianity, and it was rescuing him from slavery. And then it was in 1619 that Squanto found again an English ship on its way to the New World with a Captain Thomas Dermer this time, and he returned in 1619 to New England. When he got back to New England, he had probably the most devastating thing of his entire adventure to this point, having been across the Atlantic now 4 times on English ships. He arrived and found that there was not a single member of his tribe that was still living. An unknown disease had gone through the tribe, killed every man, woman, and child, and there was no one left that was still alive. Squanto wandered aimlessly through what had been his boyhood home, and just was at a loss until he found his way into Massasoit's camp, and Massasoit took pity on him, and he had stayed there until in March of 1621, when Samoset had reported that he had discovered these peaceful English settlers who were not doing very well, who were about to starve to death because they didn't know how to survive, and they were actually living in Tisquantum's old homeland, an area that had been avoided by the Indians because their superstition, they were afraid, they didn't know why. Everybody had died in that area, and so it was abandoned, literally belonged to no one. It was there for the pilgrims to claim. There is a report of some of the things that Squanto was able to help them with, and let me just share a little of that. This comes from a book that has been kind of well worn by our family. It's The Light and the Glory, but it does tell a little of the interaction of Squanto with the pilgrims. When Massasoit and his entourage finally left, Squanto stayed. He had found his reason for living. These English were like little babes, so ignorant were they of the ways of the wild. Well, he could certainly do something about that. The next day he went out and came back with all the eels he could hold in his hands. which the pilgrims found to be fat and sweet and excellent eating. How had he ever caught them? He took several of the young men with him and taught them how to squash the eels out of the mud with their bare feet, then catch them with their hands. But the next thing he showed them was by far the most important. It would save every one of their lives. April was corn planting month in New England, as well as in Virginia. Squanto showed the pilgrims how to plant corn the Indian way, hoeing 6-foot squares toward the center, putting down 4 or 5 kernels, and then fertilizing the corn with fish. At that, the pilgrims just shook their heads. In 4 months, they had caught exactly 1 cod. No matter, said Squanto cheerfully, in 4 days the creeks would be overflowing with fish. The pilgrims cast a baleful eye at their amazing friend, who seemed to have adopted them, but Squanto ignored them and instructed the young men how to make weirs they would need to catch the fish. Obediently, the men did as he told them, and 4 days later, the creeks for miles were clogged with alewives making their spring run. The pilgrims did not catch them, they harvested them. So now the corn was planted. Pointing spoke-like to the center of each mound were 3 fishes, their heads almost touching. Now, said Squanto, they would have to guard against wolves. Seeing the familiar, bewildered look on his charges' faces, he added the wolves would attempt to steal the fish. The pilgrims would have to guard it for 2 weeks until it had a chance to decompose. So they did. And that summer, 20 full acres of corn began to flourish. Squanto helped them in 1,000 similar ways, teaching them how to stalk deer, plant pumpkins among the corn, refine maple syrup from the maple trees, discern which herbs were good to eat and good for medicine, and find the best berries. After the corn, there was one more specific thing he did, which was of inestimable importance to their survival. What little fishing they had done was a failure, and any plan to fish commercially was a certain fiasco. So Squanto introduced them to the pelt of the beaver, which was then in plentiful supply in northern New England and of great demand throughout Europe. Not only did he get them started, but he guided them in trading, making sure they got their full money's worth in top quality pelts. This would prove to be their economic deliverance, just as corn proved to be their physical deliverance. And in that fall, there was, after having been through their starving time or their time of weakness, time of the general sickness, and having had this adoption by Squanto and success in their first harvest, was what we would probably proclaim the first American Thanksgiving. And I'll share just a little of that. For it says, the summer of 1621 was beautiful. Much work went into the building of new dwellings. 10 men were sent up north the coast in the sailing shallop to conduct trade with the Indians. Squanto once again acted as their guide and their interpreter. It was a successful trip, and that fall's harvest proved to be more than enough corn to see them through their second winter. The pilgrims were brimming over with gratitude, not only for Squanto and the Wampanoags, who had been so friendly, but also to their God. In him they had trusted, and he had honored their obedience beyond their dreams. So Governor Bradford declared a day of public thanksgiving to be held in October. Massasoit was invited and unexpectedly arrived a day early with 90 Indians. Counting their numbers, the pilgrims had to pray hard to keep from giving in to despair. To feed such a crowd would cut deeply into the food supply that was supposed to get them through the winter. But if they had learned one thing through their travails, it was to trust God implicitly. As it turned out, the Indians were not arriving empty-handed. Massasoit has commanded his braves to hunt for the occasion. They arrived with no less than 5 fully dressed deer, more than a dozen fat wild turkeys, and they helped with the preparations, teaching the pilgrim women how to make hoe cakes and a tasty pudding out of cornmeal and maple syrup. Finally, they showed them an Indian delicacy, how to roast corn kernels in an earthen pot until they popped. Fluffy, white popcorn. An American Indian tradition. The Pilgrims turned out, in turn, provided many vegetables from their household gardens: carrots, onions, turnips, parsnips, cucumbers, radishes, beets, and cabbages. Also, using some of their precious flour, they took summer fruits, which the Indians had dried, and introduced them to the likes of blueberry, apple, and cherry pie. It was all washed down with good sweet wine made from wild grapes, a joyous occasion for all. Between meals, the Pilgrims and Indians happily competed in shooting contests with gun and bow. The Indians were especially delighted when John Alden and some of the younger men of the plantation agreed to join them in foot races and wrestling. There were even military drills staged by Captain Standish. Things went so well, and Massasoit showed no inclination to leave, that Thanksgiving Day was extended for 3 days. So you're welcome to stay if you like. Surely one moment stood out in the Pilgrims' memory. William Brewster's prayer as they began the festival. They had so much for which to thank God, for providing all their needs, even when their faith had not been up to believing that he would do so, for the lives of the departed, for taking them home to be with him, for their friendship with the Indians, so extraordinary when settlers to the south of them had experienced the opposite, and all his remarkable providences in bringing them to this place and sustaining them. And so ended the first Thanksgiving, and they started into their second winter. And during that second winter, as the winter approached, in November, a ship arrived, bringing with it 35 more Pilgrims. So their number, which had dwindled by almost half, was now increased by at least 50%. And the next morning there was a sobering realization that these people who had arrived brought with them nothing. No food, no provisions. They would have to share, and a sobering decision was made that they would go on half rations for this second winter. It is reported, and maybe not entirely historically accurate, but it's a basis of a tradition, that at one point they were reduced ultimately to a daily ration of 5 kernels of corn per person. Now, they went through a hard time. Maybe it wasn't quite that bad, but it was a difficult time, a starving time, and from that grows a tradition of 5 kernels of corn that you see on each place in front of you today. Ultimately, there was another ship that put in, and they were able to trade beaver pelts and other things that they had, and get food from this ship, and they did have food to make it through the second winter. And so they began the next summer, and there are just a few more things that I'd like to share because it leads us to a second Thanksgiving that we'll take note of. It was April of 1623, and beginning what now is their third summer, time to get the year's corn planted. But as the Pilgrims went to the fields to till the ground and put in seed, there was a listlessness about them that was more than just the weakness from months of inadequate rations. They were well aware that they needed at least twice as great a yield as the first harvest, and they did not want to repeat the half-hearted effort of the second summer, when they had been too busy building houses and planting gardens to give the common cornfields the attention they needed. So the principal men of the colony decided that there would be an additional planting. But for this second planting, individual lots would be parceled out, with the understanding that the corn grown on those lots would be for the planter's own private use. Suddenly, new life seemed to infuse the Pilgrims. It made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than would have been by any means the governor or any other could use, to save him a great deal of trouble and gave far better content. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before would have alleged weakness and inability, whom to have compelled would have been thought great tyranny and oppression. But sometime after the second planting, it became apparent that the dry spell, which had begun between the two plantings, was turning into a drought. Week followed week. It would continue for 12 weeks at all, and not even the oldest Indians could remember anything like it. Edward Winslow described the drought and what followed. There scarce fell any rain, so that the stalk of that planting, which was first set, began to send forth the ear before it became half growth, and that which was later not likely to yield any at all, both blade and stalk hanging the head and changing the color in such a manner we judged it utterly dead. Our beans ran up also, not according to their wanton manner, but stood at a stay, many being parched away, as though it had been scorched before the fire. Now were our hopes overthrown, and we were discouraged. Our joy turned into mourning, because God, which hitherto had been our only shield and supporter, now seemed in his anger to arm himself against us. And who can withstand the fierceness of his wrath? These and the like considerations moved not only every good man privately to enter into examination with his own state between God and his conscience, and so to humiliation before him, but also to humble ourselves together before the Lord by fasting and prayer. To that end a day was appointed by public authority and set apart from all other employments. He goes on, but oh, the mercy of our God, who was ready to hear, as ready as we were to ask. For though in the morning when we assembled together the heavens were as clear and the drought was as like to continue as ever was, yet our exercise, continuing some 8 or 9 hours, before our departure the weather was overcast, and the clouds gathered on all sides. On the next morning distilled such soft, sweet, and moderate showers of rain, continuing some 14 days, and mixed with seasonable weather, that it was hard to say whether our withered corn or drooping affections were more quickened or revived. Such was the bounty and goodness of our God. Bradford says it came without either wind or thunder or any violence, and by degrees and in abundance, as the earth was thoroughly wet and soaked therewith, which did so apparently revive and quicken the decayed corn and other fruits, as was wonderful to see, and made the Indians astonished to behold. It had to have a profound effect on the Indians, for while their own rain dances or incantations of their medicine men did sometimes seem to have some effect, it is interesting to note the result, as Winslow comments, and all of them admired the goodness of our God toward us, that wrought so great a change in so short a time, showing the difference between their conjuration and our invocation on the name of God for rain, theirs being mixed with such storms and tempests as sometimes, instead of doing them good, it layeth the corn flat on the ground, to their prejudice, but ours in so gentle and seasonable manner as they never observed alike. There were only 2 origins of supernatural phenomena, and as the Pilgrims might have said, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The yield that year was so abundant that the Pilgrims ended up with a surplus of corn, which they were able to use in trading that winter with northern Indians who had not had a good growing season. A second day of Thanksgiving was planned, and this year there was even more reason to celebrate. Their beloved governor was to marry one Alice Southworth. Massasoit was again the guest of honor, and this time he brought his principal wife, 3 other sachems, and 120 braves. Fortunately, he again brought venison and turkey as well. The occasion described by one of the adventurers, Emmanuel Altham, in a letter to his brother. After our arrival in New England, we found our plantation in good health, and neither man, woman, or child sick. In this plantation is about 20 houses. 4 or 5 of them are very pleasant. The rest, as time will serve, shall be made better. The fishing that is in this country is indeed beyond belief. In 1 hour we got 100 cod. And now somewhat of the great cheer we had at the governor's marriage. We had 12 tasty venison, besides other pieces of roasted venison, and such good cheer and in such quantities as I wish you some of our share. For here we have the best grapes that ever you saw, and the biggest and divers sorts of plums and nuts, 6 goats, about 50 hogs and pigs, and divers hens. A better country was never seen nor heard of, for here are a multitude of God's blessing. What Altham neglected to mention, and tradition tells us, was the first course that was served on an empty plate in front of each person were 5 kernels of corn, lest anyone should forget. Psalm 100. The psalmist says, "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing. Know ye that the Lord, he is God. It is he that hath made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. Enter into his gates with thanksgiving, and into his courts with praise. Be thankful unto him, and bless his name. For the Lord is good, his mercy is everlasting, and his truth endureth to all generations."